Our guest today is Devina Mehra, Chairperson and Managing Director of First Global, a global quantitative asset management firm. Devina launched First Global 30 years ago as a securities firm, evolved it into an investment bank, and now is a leading asset management firm with a global lens. First Global was the first Asian firm to get a membership of the prestigious London Stock Exchange in the late 90s. Research, investment strategy, and fund management are the strengths of First Global. Prior to starting First Global, Devina had a 7 year long stint at Citibank working on the corporate finance and risk side. She's an IIM Ahmedabad gold medalist and was in the news for breaking a 60-year record as a college graduate for winning 8 gold medals, which were awarded to her by Rajiv Gandhi while at Lucknow University. Devina has also featured in Fortune magazine's Most Powerful Indian Women in Business in 2022. She identified major multi-baggers before they became mainstream, her most famous ones being HDFC and Amazon. My favorite story of Devina is how, when everyone on Wall Street had ridden off Amazon, First Global came out with a very bullish report on the stock and supported the company at a very tough time. So much so that Jeff Bezos personally wrote to Devina thanking her for her support. Over the last 30 years, Devina has often identified major stocks and sectors very early, and I'm thrilled to get this opportunity to interview her today on the show. This is going to be such an insightful conversation for anyone trying to learn about public market investing, both in India and globally. We have a stalwart and a legend with us today, and I'm so excited to deep dive with her. Devina, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, Shrishti.
I love starting with this question because it helps the audience understand where the person comes from. I know you grew up in Lucknow and attended Loreto Convent for schooling as well, which we both have in common, by the way. Would love to know some of your favorite childhood memories of growing up in Lucknow and what were some of the key experiences that shaped you as an individual.
Yeah, that is something we have in common, though I did my initial schooling in Carmel up to 10th, so Loreto was only 11th and 12th. And in some ways, I think the schools shape us, if not as much, but almost as much as the family does. And
Absolutely.
Lucknow itself, looking back, also shaped one. So even when I was growing up there, I always thought it was a good place to grow up in the sense that it had all the facilities of a big city. So it had per capita many more bookshops than, for instance, Mumbai has or ever had.
Yeah.
And there were flower shows, and was theater and a lot of other things. But on the other hand, it also had a very small town neighborly feeling.
Yeah.
Carmel, which was my school, was less than half a kilometer from my house, so it was very easy growing up. My parents were both in academics, so that was my background, very different from where I ended up. As I tell people, even up to the time I went to IIM Ahmedabad, I did not even know what a share was. Let alone be anywhere in the investing field. Again, very different from people who grew up in, let's say, Mumbai, who said like they were hearing about the share market on the dinner table. My
Yeah.
parents had no interest whatsoever in investing. So it is a very different background from a lot of people who grew up in places like Bombay. So but I think I thought then, and I think now that phrase did not exist at that point, birth lottery. But even when growing up, I always thought that I had been very fortunate in the circumstances in which I was born and the gifts that I was given.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think Lucknow is such a culturally rich place, and you don't appreciate it until you move out of the city and
You are so
experience the
right.
world.
So right.
Yeah.
Even on
And
the language, people tell you it's very polite, and while growing up, you think, it's okay. That's
this is just
because
how
we
you
take
talk.
it for granted. Only, for
Yeah.
example, when I landed up in IIM and people started on the first time you meet someone and they call you tu, which was the norm for people from Delhi and Bombay, and your
Yeah.
hackles rise because in Lucknow you don't call anyone tu. So when I was
Yeah.
in primary school, I had a fight with my friend, we'll go from tum to up to signify the distance, never tum to tu. So,
Yeah, that is so true. That is so true. And I've been in Delhi for the last 8 years. And what I've noticed here is that, growing up in Lucknow, I don't think we ever spoke about money or shares or wealth, and it was never in your face. But, coming to Delhi was such a cultural shock for me, even though it's literally an hour away. Because, this is in Delhi, everyone's talking about the superficial aspects, right? In terms of, money, wealth, etc. But in Lucknow, when you are growing up, it's more about culture and, like you said,
right.
etiquette and manners and so much more than
Right.
that.
I mean, in fact, most of my school friends, I did not even know, uh, uh, what their parents did and what their financial status was. Only we used to talk for hours, but that never came up. Only now, sometimes I ask them that, where was your father working? I mean, most of the mothers were not working except mine, but because I didn't know then. And it never occurred to
That
you to ever judge anyone based on their financial status. I mean, you didn't even know it. You didn't think that was
Yeah.
relevant.
That I thought I was the only one who didn't even know these things growing up, but I think that is true for anyone in Lucknow, because you really did not know, right? And even till date, do not know what my friends' parents do, or other kids who I
And I
grew up
read
with.
this Vinod Mehta's autobiography about, I mean, the title itself is The Lucknow Boy. And he
Yeah.
said that the only reason why you knew the religion, for example, of your friends was that, whose house to raid on which festival. That was the only relevance.
Love it. I love that we have Lucknow in common. But Devina, coming back to your professional journey, you started First Global over 30 years ago, right after a 7-year long stint in banking with Citibank. How did you know so early on in your career that you wanted to build out an investing firm? And as you've grown, the firm has also evolved from a securities firm to an investment bank and now a global asset management firm. So tell us about some of the key inflection points in the firm's journey as well.
Okay, so after IIM Ahmedabad, I joined Citibank, which at that time was considered kind of the number one job, and so I didn't actually interview anywhere else. And I ended up in a bank more from a process of elimination because I didn't know enough about business at that stage. So I applied to banks and consultancies, and as I said, got the first job I interviewed for. And I was in investment banking at that time. It was called merchant banking for about 5 years in Citi. And see, Citi was a very internally competitive and political game playing kind of environment, which did not suit me. I mean, that's not me. I can say that I don't like to play games, but I think it's also that I'm not capable of playing games. So I'm a pretty straightforward person. So it didn't suit me. And also, merchant banking, after a couple of years, I was a little bored of it. And because I thought, the learning had kind of tapered off as it happened. I ended up spending 5 years there, and I'll tell you in hindsight that those dots connected. And then I moved on to something I really enjoyed, which was corporate credit and risk, because that was learning about industries and companies. And remember, at that time, there was no profession called securities research. It did not exist in India. So much so that even at IIM Ahmedabad, let alone a course, we did not even have a full module on securities research because that didn't exist in India. So that was a scene. And then in the early 90s, there were two things which happened. So I was looking at, what do I change to, so much so that I met all sorts of people from the Economic Times editor to the director of the museum. At that time, it was called Prince of Wales Museum in Bombay, just to understand, what is a different career that I can have. And for me, always the urge was learning. So that's why, as I said, in merchant banking, I wanted to switch because I thought the learning had tapered off. And I did enjoy the last 2 years where there was great deal of learning. And so, as I said, there were two things which changed in the early 90s. One was Dr. Manmohan Singh's budget, which opened the market to foreign institutional investors. And I said, now the market will professionalize, because till then you had only the very traditional old fashioned brokers who uh, who may or may not even have been very educated. There was a time when becoming a stockbroker was something that only people who could do other things in life ended up in a lot of families. And the other thing was that Bombay Stock Exchange, at that time, NSE also did not exist. So the Bombay Stock Exchange advertised that they would give 71 new memberships to professionals. And this was at 55 lakhs per membership. At that time, the market price of a BSE membership, or BSE card as it was called, was 2 crores. And so while 55 lakhs was a huge amount in itself, it was a quarter of the market price. A lot of people told me, don't even apply. You are a complete outsider, because BSE was a broker's club. It was all Gujus and Madus. And they said, like, you're not even from the community. You're a total outsider. They won't give it to you. They have enough of their own Bhatijas to give it to. I said, let me apply. Let me see. So all this that you hear about manifestation or visualization of goals, I always say that for me, the BSE card is like kind of the biggest example of that, because logically there was no way you saw that you could get it, but you finally did get it, and everything also connected in hindsight. Just to give you two examples, one was that the 5 years I spent in merchant banking, here you needed capital market experience, and the only department in a bank that counted towards it was merchant banking. So this
Wow.
5 years did
Okay.
come in handy. And of course, yeah, that's a fact that the brokers tried their hardest not to give it to me. But at the end, I got 2 extra marks for my IIM gold medal, and that pushed me over the cutoff. So as I said, all the dots connected. I did not even know that in their marking system they had this thing of 2 extra marks for a gold medal, but that just pushed me over the cutoff. So I got the BSE card. At that time, there was no corporate membership either. So it had to be a proprietorship or a partnership. So this was my proprietorship. So my early
Right.
research reports also, at the bottom you see member BSE, Messrs. Devina Mehra. Of course, a year or two later, then NSE came about. Then of course, corporate membership was allowed, so that became First Global. I mean, we were using the First Global name even prior to that for the research, but then the broking company also became First Global. And as far as research is concerned, along with the foreign institutions came the foreign brokers. But
Yeah.
the thing is this, in the beginning, I thought all these guys have been doing it in US or whichever developed country for 50 years, 70 years. They must know how to do it, and I must see and learn from them. But the first lot of reports I saw, I said, this is junk. I mean, I said, this is not great content, and it is so boringly done, bullet points, graphs, charts, which no one wants to read. So after that, I never looked at what competition was doing. And I always then, therefore, work from first principles, which is the way I always anyway like to learn. So read the books, read the research papers, and then do the work and think a lot. So I always tell people that read, but don't take anything as the gospel. So always question. Like at that time, the norm was that markets are efficient. And I said, what do you mean by markets are efficient? If you're saying the price at which a stock trades is always the right price, then why does the price, I mean, the price can change 50% in a quarter with no new information. So
Yeah.
was that price low, the lower price, the efficient price, or the higher price, the efficient price? So this doesn't make any sense to me. And so on. I mean, we did a lot of theoretical work also. I devised a lot of new ratios because we just went past the 30-year mark. I have been, revisiting some of those 25, 26, 27-year-old reports. And now you're looking at it as an outsider, as someone else's work in almost that sense. And I find the rigor which we had then is still not matched, I think, overall in the industry. So we were very careful that as a firm that you must do a lot of good work on the competence side, and whatever you say must be with full honesty and integrity, even if it upsets a company, even if it upsets a client of yours, which might be a large fund which is holding that stock. It must be exactly how you see it. Even now, I mean, sometimes people tell me, ma'am, you are very honest on TV. And I always think that I'm not even making a decision in this. It doesn't occur to me to say anything other than what I really mean. So that was the 90s. We were basically became very large institutional brokers dealing almost exclusively with FIIs, with foreign institutional
Right.
investors, and all based on intellectual capital, because started with very little capital and never took outside capital. And so that was the 90s. And then towards the end of the 90s, there was a change, which is, you mentioned that we globalized. And uh, again, this was a total pioneering effort. So there were again two triggers. One was the Asian crisis of 98, 99, which brought home to me that what is the risk of being in a single market. An investor in Indonesia lost 90% of her net worth in 1 year, and Taiwan 50%, and Thailand, Philippines, South Korea, everybody in between. I said, this is the risk of being in a single market. And the other thing was that I said, like, I was bored. I said, how long am I going to do the same old companies, the Bajaj Auto, the HPCL, and the Infosys and HDFC and all that. So that was so those were the two triggers. As I said, my motivation has always been learning. And at that time, when I decided on this, I said, let me think of adding some global markets. So by that time, as I said, since we were dealing with the foreign institutions, people become friends over a period of time, and not just the India fund manager, their boss, their boss's boss. They all become friends. I mean, now some of them are not even in the business, but they are still your friends. So when I thought of this, I bounced it off them that, what do you think? I want to go out. And they said, do add a Philippines or a Thailand or something like that, and the emerging market fund manager will give you some business there as well. Then what's the fun in adding small markets? I want to go to the big markets. And this said, like, who will listen to you? No, they have the Merrill Lynches and the Morgan Stanleys and the Goldmans and whoever. So you are a nobody. Nobody will listen to you in a large market. And if you want to go to a large market, do the small stocks which no one is covering. I said, no, I want to go to the large markets and do the large stocks. If I know how to do it, I'll see. So, I mean, against all advice, because at that time, no one had thought that research could be done offshore or anything like that. Uh, we became not just the first Indian, but the first Asian members of the London Stock Exchange, other than the Japanese, in 1999, so 25 years ago. And then the next year of the NASD. So we we started covering not just US and UK stocks, but stocks in Europe, even the larger stocks in Japan and China. We've been covering since then. And the most gratifying thing, Shrishti, was this, that at least in India, you also know the media. You know a lot of the journalists and editors and all that. There, you didn't know anyone. So it was only
Yeah.
your work, in a sense, almost anonymously going out there. And in no time, we were in Forbes, Fortune, Business Week, Barron's, the Wall Street Journal, front page, everywhere, just on the quality of our work.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, nobody does real in-depth work, whether it is regarding companies or industries or even macro indicators. I mean, we were more accurate on our macroeconomic forecasts without having a single economist in my team at that point, where we did
Wow.
hire later. But at that time, I had only the engineer MBAs, and they said, ma'am, ye kaise karenge? This is too hard, and we've never done economics. I said, it's the same way that you do a company projection, that you drill down to the level possible and you project every line, and your totals are going to be more accurate than somebody who's doing a surface level job. And that was the fact. I mean, our very first report on the UK macro economy, we had this cover saying Bangkok. I mean, we always had very provocative covers. So the clickbait, again, as a term, didn't exist, but that's, we always had great substance, but also very provocative cover. So the cover was that Bank of England's GDP estimates won't be met. And we were right. I mean, I used to laugh that Bank of England would have hundreds of economists on their rolls, but it's a question of doing the work. So that was a thrill. So from, you can say, roughly around 2000 onwards, we covered global stocks, and then the next switch was from, so till now, then we were a broking and investment banking firm. So investment banking, we used to do what is now called qualified institutional placements, QIP, but very, very, very selectively. So, because still I was convinced that it made sense for someone buying it, no matter how attractive the fees, I never got tempted. So we did very early issues. For example, Bharti, even before it got its Airtel license, when it used to be a push button telephone company. Uh, and many others. So that was one phase. But after a while, it gets a little frustrating because you are recommending something to a fund manager who may or may not pull the trigger for reasons of their own. So the natural progression was to asset management. So I actually started with the global asset management first in 2015, and then the India PMS in 2020.
Okay.
So, I mean, you would be surprised, Shrishti, that we had the PMS license, the Portfolio Management Services license, for almost 20 years before we started. So we
Oh,
got
wow,
it,
20 years.
I think in 2000 or 2001, whenever the SEBI regulations first came out, we got a license. And internally also, there used to be a pressure that we have the license, we have the brand name, why are we not launching? And the reason was very simply that I do not use it as a phrase. To me, this is something very, very fundamental, that there is a very grave fiduciary responsibility when you take someone else's hard earned money to manage. So you must be very sure what you are doing. So I did not want to take people's money and manage it according to my whims and fancies. So your own money, you can do what you want, that you buy 10 stocks, two do so well, that your sins of the others are washed out. So I said, if I have to take outside money, I must have something where there is some consistency, some predictability, some forecastability, and that came with a system. So now we use what we call a human plus machine model, which is that
Right.
the core there is a artificial intelligence and machine learning model, but not as a black box, just as it's a sort of, you can say, codification of the expertise and applying it on a consistent, noise-free, bias-free basis of the entire universe of stocks. And then, of course, before and after, there are human filters. But so since we launched this a little over 4 years ago, so we've been right on top on the multi-cap, large cap, flexi cap side, and more so on a risk-adjusted basis. The gap is even higher because we manage for risk. I mean, our system
Right.
manages for risk, we manage for risk, and that's always our focus, that risk management first, which is that you prevent any large losses. And that was proven that, that system works both in the COVID crash, where we mostly sidestepped the big crash. So instead of, that 35-40% that everybody was down, we were down in the 10% range in both globally and in India. Then also even at the Russia-Ukraine war. So all the stress tests this is performed. So we know what we are doing on this. And as I said, because it's a system, it is more predictable. Like one of my favorite authors, Daniel Kahneman, says that reasonably designed system will always outperform a human being. So because it eliminates human bias, it eliminates random noise.
Yeah.
So that's been the journey. And as I say, that I didn't mind being the first to go global. I didn't mind being almost the last to launch a PMS. It was only when I was confident that I could do a good job for the person on the other side. So, that's part of my first principles thinking, that it has to be, I have to be convinced I can do a decent job for the person on the other side, and only then you launch. Doesn't matter what everyone else is saying.
Amazing. You've truly been a pioneer in so many aspects. I think, even you talking about quant investing, while globally, 30-40% of the market is controlled by quant investing. But in India, I think most fund managers still have a very narrative and stories focused approach in terms of conveying their fund thesis. But whenever I've seen you on TV, or, you've spoken in your posts or anywhere, you always take a very quant first approach. Where does that come from? Are you doing that very consciously to eliminate bias? And there is so much more retail participation now in India. There's so many new investors in the market. What would your advice be to them in terms of taking charge of their emotions when being in the market?
Yeah, there are two or three things to this. One is that, you know, quant is something now is becoming a buzzword. So I hear some people use it just that we are launching a quant fund or a quant scheme. And some of them, like we have used this human plus machine for a while. So I saw two schemes at least of funds which said man plus machine. So human, they have downgraded to man. And I said, like, if you cannot even think of a three-word title, you think they're going to do the rigor of a million lines of code which we have. And
Yeah.
it's a very rigorous process. So people ask me to do quant methods work, and I tell them that if I ask you, are models made in Excel good or bad, you would say that's an absurd question. Excel is just a tool, depends on what you put in it. And so also
Yeah.
for artificial intelligence and machine learning, those are all tools. So it depends on what you are putting in it. So the quant methods are neither good nor bad. And see, this I have seen for 30 years, that anything that we talk about, I talk about, or First Global talks about, is the buzzword is picked up very quickly. So I've seen this over the years. But
Yeah.
hardly anyone does the first principles thinking, or the, like for example, our India equity fund is called India Super 50 because we say that we will invest in roughly 50 stocks. And recently, an elderly family office manager was asking me that, earlier people used to come and tell me that, in fact, we use his word, he said, Devina ji, pehle jo पीएमएस वाले आते थे, वो कहते थे कि 15-20 स्टॉक्स में ही आउट परफॉर्मेंस आएगी। अब वही लोग आके कहते हैं कि नहीं 40-50 स्टॉक होने चाहिए। तो क्या बदल गया इन 2 सालों में? ऐसे सर एक ही चीज बदल गई, आवर परफॉर्मेंस, एंड पीपल थिंक देयर इज सम मैजिक टू higher number of stocks, but they don't realize it is not the higher number of stocks or what that higher number of stocks is doing. I mean, that's a whole different topic, but what diversification or a higher number of stocks does is very simply this. In a game of skill and luck, which is investing, it increases the component of skill, decreases the component of luck. So it is not the number of stocks which is the magic, it is depending on what skill you are bringing to the table. So if you
Yeah.
have the skill, then this will work. If you don't have the skill, it won't work. So I mean, people don't even realize what the logic is. So it's very easy to, just look at the buzzwords. But yes, the point is that for anyone, uh, eliminating bias is near impossible. I mean, Daniel Kahneman died recently at the age of 90, and he spent a lifetime
Yeah.
studying biases. And he said, even so, my decision making has barely changed, because intellectually understanding something doesn't mean you can eliminate it, because they are very
Yeah.
hardwired. And the reason they are very hardwired, Shrishti, is simply this, that they served a purpose in human evolution. They are there because they served a purpose, and human evolution is concerned with two things: survival and procreation. As I say often, it doesn't care about your portfolio. So, for example, everyone wants to be where everyone else is. So, everyone wants to be in the consensus. And this is very deep rooted within us, because as human beings, when we were living in tribes, leaving that tribe meant definitely you could not procreate. And most of the time, it also put a question mark on survival. So we are the progeny of people who opted to stay in the tribe. So that's why it's very uncomfortable to be outside consensus. It's
Yeah.
so hardwired within us. Loss aversion, again, hardwired within us. Stories, you said. I mean, stories are what make us human. Across all civilizations, across time, from the hunter-gatherer to the most sophisticated, and across geographies, one thing is
Yeah.
common: stories. That we communicate through stories, we remember stories, we teach through stories. And that's why all ads are stories. They're never bland statistics. So if I tell you that 5 lakh children in this, district are malnourished, you'll turn the page. But if I give a picture or video of one kid or one family which is starving, you are more likely to give money to that charity. So it's very
Yeah.
hardwired within us. But as I say, the market is not a human being. The market doesn't care how carefully your stories are crafted and communicated. So the
Yeah.
bottom line is that even as a lay investor, you must decide on a system, even if it's a simple system, that you look at these 4 ratios or 5 ratios and you invest according to that. Because often people say they invest according to XYZ, but if you see their actual portfolio, it is quite different, because they heard something on a Telegram group, they saw somebody on TV, some friend told them something. So they are not
Yeah.
doing even that little bit systematically. The other thing which within our organization we practice is, we say, investing, it is human plus machine. On risk management, it is machine only. that do not override the system. So always have
Yeah.
stop losses, for example, because human beings hate admitting mistakes. Again, this is a bias. The machine is
Yeah.
indifferent to failure or success, it learns from both. So there are many things like this which actually a system brings, and that is why Daniel Kahneman says that a system, even if it's a much simplified system, uh, outperforms a human being. And I see, I'm not using AI ML because it is available or because that's the next big thing. There's a very
Yeah.
fundamental change in investing which has happened, which people have not realized, or even when they have realized, they have not reacted to it. And the analogy I give is, our national game is hockey, and you'd
Yeah.
wonder why hockey when we haven't done anything in hockey for a good 50 years. And the reason is that from about 1928 to the mid 70s, India and later India and Pakistan dominated hockey. We had like six Olympic gold medals in a row. We had two later on, and there were Olympics when we didn't concede a single goal. So we were that good. And then
Yeah.
what changed in the 1970s? Something fundamental changed, and that was the playing field. Instead of natural grass, you moved to artificial grass or astroturf, it was called. And suddenly the skill set required to succeed changed. So that Major Dhyan Chand's great stick work, dribbling, those kind of skills became less relevant, and you had to be very fast, you had to be very fit. All those things Indians were not that good at. Neither did you have the kind of nutrition and exercise technology which the most developed nations had. So you were suddenly nowhere in hockey for decades on end. And that is the kind of seminal shift that has happened in investing. So whereas people are still managing either their own money or even professional fund managers, dealing with very, very large corpuses, are still doing it the way they were doing it in the 90s. And mind you, I was a pioneer on the conventional securities research side, and I absolutely loved going around the countryside. And, I visited a lot of plants. I would like going and meeting company managements, or let alone managements. I even like going and meeting the people at the factory. But all of that aside, what has fundamentally changed now is at that time, the edge was an information edge, that by meeting
Yeah.
a company you get extra information. And not just in India, in the US also, Fidelity or Franklin Templeton could sit in a room and get some information from a Walmart or an IBM or a P&G which was not publicly available. That is no longer the case. Now
Yeah.
by regulation, all information has to be available to everyone. So much so in the 1990s, let alone smaller companies, even a Tata Steel or a Tata Motors, Tisco or Telco as they were called, if I wrote a sell report, next time we would not get an invite for the next quarterly meet or call. So, but now all the con call transcripts are there for everyone. So now
Yeah.
the skill set required instead of an information edge has become who can deal with masses of data. And that is what the machine enables us to do, to deal with masses of data on a bias free, noise free basis. So, like for example, internationally, globally, we look at 20,000 odd securities. So if I have 20,000 or 22,000 securities, even if I hire 1,000 analysts, it they will not look at it on the same basis. That's
Yeah.
what is meant by noise, that you give everybody, let's say financial analysts, everybody with 15 years experience, you give them the same data, they will come up with different conclusions. So the machine means that it is on a noise free. It's the same person. I mean, you have a fight in the traffic on the way into office, you will look at the same data differently. So that's what is noise. So the machine eliminates bias, which is systematic, and it also eliminates noise. So that's why when you have this masses of data, the only way to deal with it is through a machine. I mean, I was on a few months back, I was on this panel with some fund managers, and not prompted by me. Both of them said information arbitrage is gone. And I was thinking, so, I mean, you're still saying that you will outperform. So you are in a market, and markets attract the smartest minds all over the world. You're saying you
Yeah.
will be smarter than the market all the time. How? Without a system, it is not possible. I mean, you're playing luck otherwise. And that will favor you at times. So that's why I
Yeah.
mean sometimes when we talk to people, they will say, I invested in this PMS or this fund. It did well for 3 years. Now 2 years, it's been doing very badly, or vice versa. Like the small cap funds did very badly from 2018 to 21, and last 3 year CAGR looks very good, but that's what it is. So the machine forces you to be systematic and therefore consistent and therefore reasonably predictable.
Yeah, I think so much in wisdom you've shared in just those answers because, when we talk about what's happening in the markets, I think there is a lot of frenzy, right? Which is what we're seeing in the SME IPO space, we're seeing in the small cap space also. And you are seeing so many new entrants into the market in terms of companies getting listed. I come from the private investing world, so there is pressure on companies to go public also by VC funds to be able to show liquidity to their LPs. So, are there any thoughts around the small cap space or SME IPO space, because it's seeing so much frenzy all of a sudden? One has to be very cautious, when there is that kind of frenzy in the market. So, what are your thoughts on the small cap and the SME IPO space?
Yeah, exactly what you said, that when there's so much
Yeah,
frenzy, you need to be cautious. And there are two other reasons that I talked about risk management. In small caps, it's virtually impossible to do risk management. There are two reasons. One, stop losses don't work because when those stocks fall, they can just go circuit down every day and there is no exit. So
yeah,
that's one. Number two, the other way we manage risk is by hedging. So, for example, currently our PMS portfolios are part hedged, but the only liquid hedge available is a put on the Nifty, and the small caps don't move along with the Nifty. So you have effectively no hedge available either. So I'll tell you
yeah,
what we have done. We have in stocks between 1,000 and 5,000 crore market cap, we normally have 14-15% of our fund. At the highest, we've gone to 20-22%. And right now, we are in the about 5-7% range. So it's that dramatic. We've actually cut back, knowing that in the short term, it hurts relative performance because right now, last few months, the PMS schemes or the mutual fund schemes which have done the best are who have weighted more towards the small caps. We know that.
yeah,
But as I said, we manage for risk first. So investing is a loser's game. I repeat that often. There's a very good article by Charles Ellis. It's a 1970s article that's always been part of my training kit, just the loser's game, and which is about that every game in the world is a winner's game or a loser's game, and games transform. So aviation, when JRD Tata was doing it, was a winner's game. It was an adventure sport. In this famous Karachi London flight at that time, uh, he didn't land on the right airstrip altogether, or some
yeah,
part failed and he had to improvise with something. But now there's only one way to fly an aircraft. Make no mistakes, go by the checklist. So something is similar in investing, that all our, maybe at our grandparents' time, it was a winner's game when information was not generally available. Even annual reports were not easily available. And
yeah.
obviously, there were no spreadsheets to easily look at financials. Then you could find hidden gems. Now you have to first manage that you don't have any big losses on your portfolio. So you win if you don't lose. That's the mantra. So that being the case, yes, right now the risks are high. Again, you talked of new entrants in the market. Most of them don't remember what can happen in a small cap portfolio. I mean, the small cap index as a whole in 2008-9 fell nearly 80%, 78% to be exact. And then in that level came back in 2016, and this is only, I mean, in a manner of speaking, that level came back because the stocks were completely different. The stocks were not what they were in 2008-9, because that index churns 20% every year. So in 8 years, it's a completely different index. Many companies which fall in a small cap fall never come back. They disappear into the blue yonder. Only 4,000 odd companies trade actively on the exchanges. Many more have listed over the years. There have been years when there have been 1,200 and 1,300 listings. So again, people forget history. 2016, as I said, it crossed that. And then 17, 18, there was another 1.5 year mad bull run. And then again, it just disappeared. Again, it fell 2/3. The index itself fell 2/3. So many of the small cap, micro cap managers who are coming out of the woodwork saying I compounded 50% for 3 years lost
Yeah.
80 to 100% of the portfolios in 18, 19. So I said, don't forget your school mathematics that if something falls 80%, it compounds 50% for 3 more years, you are still down 1/3 from your original investment. So those are the things. So be very cautious, and no matter how well you select, this is the other argument that I'm selecting my stocks very well and doesn't matter what happens to the index. But how many stocks did not fall in that 2008-9? 1%. How many did not fall in that 18-19 crash? 8%. So you are not going to be there.
Thank you, Devina, for sharing that. I think our audience needs to tread with caution in the small cap space, where it might be very hard to do right now, right? Like when your friends are talking about 30 to 50% IRR sitting on their PMSs and mutual funds, it's very hard to not get affected or carried away with that. But there's so much wisdom in what you were sharing. But Devina, let's talk about how the US indices were in the 90s. Since you had that exposure, it was mostly banking, retail and FMCG stocks, and now it's all tech companies in the top 10 companies by market cap. I think Microsoft was the only player which still is in the top 10 companies listed in the US, and there are lots of predictions around how this will be true for India as well. What are your thoughts about this prediction and the new age IPOs that are happening? Do you think certain companies have the potential to displace the top 10 stocks in India today?
So before coming to this question, let me just take off from what you commented on the last answer. FOMO is the last thing you should have as your guiding principle. So, I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of mistakes in the market are made by this thing of fear of missing out, whether it is an industry theme, whether this is small cap versus large cap, and that's why people get into these thematic funds, whether it's a defense fund or a small cap fund or a PSU fund. And that is why the fund houses launch these funds. I mean, this is a pet peeve of mine that this is essentially mis-selling, because most thematic funds, if you plot them, come just before the peak of that theme, because that is the time everybody has seen other people make money, as you mentioned, and they want to jump onto that bandwagon, and that's recipe for disaster. Now, somebody shared this with me that but if thematic funds are good, and you look at there was a tech fund from a large mutual fund house saying that, see, it was 2 rupees in 2003, and over 20 years it has gone up X number of times. And I said, very good, it was 2 rupees in 2003. Did you see when it was launched? It was time to perfection. It was launched just 1 week before the global tech crash. I said it went from 10 rupees to 2 rupees. And then you are telling me from 2 rupees it has compounded so much. So always, I mean, you will not go wrong with this as a guiding principle, that whichever sector or theme you see a lot of new fund offerings, it is close to the peak. It
Are
almost
you
never
hinting
goes
that
wrong.
we're towards the end of a cycle in India now?
On certain themes, but not on the market as a whole. Because again, we are very data driven. So I step back and look at the data, and the data, very interestingly, on the mainstream indices is this, that from, we think the equity markets give us 15-16% return compounded. But if you look at the uh, decade of 2010 to 20, we compounded only little over 8.5%. And that doesn't capture it as much as the statistic that if you had invested beginning of that decade 100 rupees, you would have got only 230 at the end of the decade, when fixed deposit itself would have given you around 200. So you got no return from equity. In contrast, if 1980-81 you had invested 100 rupees, it would have become 700 in 10 years. So that huge underperformance from that 2010 to 20 decade is what created the room for this bull market, and still you're not above the trend line. So the risk of
Right.
a sustained crash is when you're way above the trend line. That's not the case. And otherwise, if a crash doesn't look imminent, it is better to remain invested. So, for example, this year there have been times when we felt maybe there will be excess volatility, as it happened both in March and June. That volatility was very short-lived, but we have been hedged earlier. Before the election, we were fully hedged. Now also we are partly hedged. So if you're uncertain, better to buy a hedge, which as insurance does cost money, but better not to be out of the market, because this is another statistic that in 40 years, if you miss out on just the 10 best days, and this holds for not just India, any market virtually you pick up, you lose out on about two-thirds of the return. So if your 100 rupees had become 60,000, let us say, you would now be at 20,000. If you miss out on the 30 best days, which is just less than a day a year, you will be down to not even 6,000. So there's a risk to being invested in the market, but the risk to sitting it out is also there. So
Right.
what we are following as of now is that be away from the small cap, micro cap, generally speaking, be fully invested, but be partly hedged, because we don't
Right.
see it as a big negative, on a 1-2 year basis, the the scenario on the mainstream indices. So coming back to what you said on the US indices, so even in India, I mean, people talk about the Nifty P or the Sensex P, but if you break it down into industries, it has changed so much. 20 odd years ago, in our indices, there were, I think, no banks at all. And now that's the highest weight in the index. There was a time around year 2000 when we had so many PSUs: ONGC, Indian Oil, HP, BP, MTNL, BSNL, BHEL. So much of your concentration was on PSUs. And then there came a phase when people forgot that the PSUs ever existed.
Yeah.
So, so that's why, I mean, I'm not a big votary of looking at on the index aggregates, because the composition changes so much. And as far as the US is concerned, I mean, around year 2000 wasn't as if the tech was not around, but the tech then meant a whole different group of companies. There was IBM, Dell, Motorola, Cisco. People forget at one point was the highest market cap company in the whole world.
Yeah.
I mean, no one remembers, so it was the Nvidia of its time, you can say. That,
Yeah, I was hearing this podcast where they were talking about how Cisco was actually the most significant tech company before the crash happened, and no one remembers that aspect about it anymore. It was a Sequoia funded company that went public and aggressively captured market share and scaled very rapidly compared to what you can think about Nvidia is doing at this stage.
right.
But there's no talk about Cisco anymore. So, that's where people need to be very cautious about Nvidia and other hype names also.
So, I mean, I mean, of course, yeah, and of the Magnificent Seven, Nvidia is the only one with where we were overweight. And of course, we cut back, but in the last 2 quarters, they've still blown out the light.
Yeah.
You are right on this, that as I said, that the list in the US changes far more rapidly than it does in India. And of the tech majors, Microsoft is the only one which was a major then and is a major now.
Yeah.
Everything else has gone out. What was considered tech then is, I mean, the companies are around, but they are not so relevant anymore. Or even if you look at the S&P itself, around the 1960s or something, the average age of the company in the S&P was 50 years. In 2015, it was down to 18. Now it must be even lower than that.
Right.
So when things are going well, there's this book called The Halo Effect. So, when things are going well, everything about that company is great. It's the most admired company list. It will be the best places to work in list. Like at one point, ABB also went through, obviously it didn't have the kind of market cap that Cisco had, but it also went through a major boom. And at that time, it was that look, they're acquiring so many companies. The CEO is so decisive, and look at the growth and all that. And then when it started to flounder, the same characteristics become negative. That the CEO doesn't listen to anyone. They're acquiring too many companies. So it's very funny that there's another book called Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer. So as I tell people
Yeah.
that, the same thing that, let us say, interest rates are uh, not getting cut. So it can be used to justify a market up move or a down move, that it is not getting cut, therefore it's a negative drag on the company or on the market, or it's not getting cut because the economy is doing so well, so that's a positive for the market. So it can be argued any which way.
But coming to the question about new age tech stocks, so do you think the current top 10, at least in India, will be replaced by some of these new players? Maybe the ones that have already gone public, or do you think those companies are yet to go public?
You can't say for sure. You don't know. But ultimately, of course, profits and cash flows have to show up. So
Yeah.
at the time all these IPOs came, which was there was one big boom in 21, if you remember. That's when a lot of these
Yeah.
companies went public, and I was on television at that time saying this is valuations are crazy. People are saying that so and so large VC invested in it, but I said that's their exit price. It's your entry price, and so
Yeah.
many other things, because many of the companies, when they go into IPO, they cut back on marketing spend to show some profit or a lower loss. Then there are companies like like Nika, for example, that you create a market where none existed, but once you have created that market, someone else can also get VC funded and tap that market. So that people are making 15-year, 20-year projections. You how do you know? You don't know. I mean, anyone who tells you that they will know in advance that which company is going to be a multi-bagger is talking nonsense. I mean,
Yeah.
people ask me that two of our very famous calls. One was HDFC Bank a year after its IPO in 1996, and that had a picture of uh, a baby on the cover saying this is where it is, and it had Arnold Schwarzenegger saying this is where it will be. And that
Right.
turned out, obviously. And then there was Amazon after the tech crash in 2001, when the whole of Wall Street had a sell and saying it will go out of business, it will go bankrupt, and we had a strong buy on what is now split at just at 75 cents. And Jeff Bezos sent us an email saying thanks for the support, because nobody else even had a buy. And that was purely based on their cash flows. But that apart, I mean, sometimes on social media, somebody will say, I just had a baby, which is the stock like HDFC Bank or Amazon that you can recommend that I can buy and forget for 25 years. And I said, no such crystal ball exists. If there was such a crystal ball, at least someone in the world, some investor, some fund manager would have had a track record of, if not 100% multi-baggers, but even 50% multi-baggers. There's nobody who has that. Not Warren Buffett, nor Rakesh Chunjunwala, no one. I mean, Warren Buffett sells all that he buys, he sells something like 80% of that within 2 years. So 80% of that he is probably acknowledging that it's a mistake. So, that's the thing, because this is a game of uncertainty. Tell people
Yeah.
that after living through 2020, if you do not understand that this is a game of probability, ambiguity, and uncertainty, when will you learn? I mean, not only did you not know that there was a pandemic, but if I had told you there was a pandemic and hotels, travel, retail, so many businesses would come to zero, would you have said that there would be a boom? So I
No.
would rather, I mean, I always err on the side of caution. And you being on the non-public markets, you would know that VCs buy things as a basket,
Yeah.
and they assume that a large part of them will turn out to be mistakes. Whereas the retail investor is buying one or two stocks, you don't know what will happen to those stocks. Even if, let us say some new technology comes, some new theme on ESG, on green, on EV, on this and that. But what is going to work, you don't know. There are so many technologies which showed great deal of promise and which fizzled out. But even if the technology works, what really transformed human existence in the 20th century, two big things: automobiles and aviation.
Yeah.
Both have been a graveyard of companies. So even if the technology is life transforming, you don't know which company will succeed or if any company at all will succeed. So these are all again stories. So I mean, always err on the side of caution. Always. I mean,
Yeah,
Apple,
absolutely.
Apple alone, if you look at 20 years, not 1, 2, 3, 4 years, 20 years after its IPO, it had barely given any return. After
Yeah.
17 years, it was still at the IPO price. Even after 20 years, it had compounded only 3%. And people again have the story in mind that Steve Jobs came back and Apple turned around. But 7 years, a good 7 years after he came back, Apple was a marginal profit company 1 year, marginal loss the next year. Like that, it went till they had one hit product in iPod. So, this is stories are very easy to make and stories are very simplified. They're very linear. But that's not, if you actually read histories of companies, you will find that it was never that smooth to start with. I mean, Amazon tried dozens of things, failed in most, one or two took off. That's the pattern.
Yeah, and coming because these are very famous examples in your investment journey, also where when everyone had written off Amazon, you had a strong buy on it, and Jeff thanked you for it also. And then similarly in HDFC's case, when it went IPO at a price of 38 rupees, I think you had a strong buy on it.
Yeah,
Wait,
which is
so
3.8 rupees on today's level.
wow, amazing. So, but in hindsight, what were some of those signals that helped you identify these companies very early on? And in your personal capacity, would you have stayed invested for all these years hence?
See, first of all, no one, not Aditya Puri, nor Jeff Bezos, could have predicted the trajectory of the companies, of the stocks. So,
Yeah.
at the most, when you're recommending a stock, you can say that I think this will double or triple. There's no real visibility beyond that. Because you can put any numbers you like in the spreadsheet, and this is an important point, though not exactly what you asked, which is that if you pick up any company, any research report on any company, it will show growth every year, right? Growth every year for the next 5 years. After that, you assume a terminal value, which is also some growth out into perpetuity. Let alone out into perpetuity. Can you imagine out of these 4,000 odd companies that actively trade on the Indian exchanges, how many have shown some growth? Just G greater than zero, just some growth, not even 5%, 10%, some growth every year for even 10 years. 10 years, not a very long time. So guess out of 4,100 roughly companies, how many have shown that kind of number?
I think I read that Marcellus's Consistent Compounders book where it said top 20, there are 20 or 25 stocks which have grown 15 to 20% year on year.
I don't know
I
what
don't know if
I
that's
don't know what he was looking at. I haven't seen the book, but the actual data is that a profit growth greater than zero. I'm not talking 15%, 20%, greater than zero every year for 10 years. Last year we did that exercise. There were only 17 companies, and this was not an outlier. We've done this
17.
exercise 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's all about the same. Some years it might be 25 companies, some years it might be 19 companies, but in that range. So that
Right.
is all. G greater than zero. 20 years, there were only two companies, HDFC Bank and Supreme Industries. And Supreme had a profit decline the following year. So as of now, it's only HDFC Bank, which has shown some earnings growth every year for 20 plus years. It is as difficult as that. So how do
Yeah.
you predict a long-term trajectory for a company? I mean, the management doesn't know what they will do next year. How can you know that what will they do next year? Even good companies like Hindustan Lever, 1999 to 2010, 10, 11 years, it did virtually nothing. I mean, not just as a stock, but even in business, there was hardly any growth. So
Yeah.
that's the thing. The things are never as predictable as a Excel sheet makes it out to be. So you can never know that what will like. If you look at Rakesh Jhunjhunwala's portfolio, for example, I mean, he bought hundreds of companies. So every time you'd meet him, there would be different companies he'd be talking about. But almost all his fortune was made in just three, four stocks: Crisil, Titan, Lupin, and one or two others. But in people's again head, it becomes a story that he knew that these companies were going to do so well. Nobody knows. I mean, the Warren
Yeah.
Buffett says that in 70 years of investing, you take out my 10 best decisions and my portfolio will look like a disaster. But did he know in advance which would be those 10 decisions? No, he didn't. No one does.
Yeah.
You cannot.
I think the power law applies there as well, right? Similar to the VC investing world, where we know out of 10 companies, maybe one or two are going to be
Yeah.
outliers, while four, five might not survive, two, three might just about return your
Yeah.
money.
So that's
So
why
I
I
guess,
say always follow a system. System doesn't mean, necessarily elaborate system like ours, but whatever
yeah,
system, that these are the criteria by which I will choose companies, but have then 25, 30 stocks in your portfolio. Now, which is what, like, for example, PMS, of course, is 50 lakhs and above. So we have a small case product also, which follow the similar principles, but there we have 25 to 30 stocks. But that we think is about the minimum you need in your portfolio. And again, some of those will turn out to be mistakes. So I always say the best thing you can do for your portfolio is that anytime you're buying a stock, tell yourself it can be a mistake, because some of them will be mistakes. And
yeah.
then you will have some which will give you some return, and if you are lucky, maybe two or three will turn out to be multi-baggers. So that's the what we
Thank
will
you
go
for
for.
making it, explaining it so rationally to us, because, young people watching it in the audience who are also new market entrants can get carried away by the noise in the market right now, that, just invest in a company and let it compound for 20, 30 years. And, that is how you will get rich and wealthy. But that is the common narrative out there, unfortunately. So I think hearing from you, who has seen cycles over 30 years, is very, very important for them.
I mean, you see all these fancy projections. As I said, I had done a
I
post
think
which
my
was
favorite one is the one which says invest 10 lakhs and it becomes 100 crores, in terms of fooling people, because, consistently compound your money between 24, 26%, and then you have 100 crores at the end of 30 years. But that's also encouraging people to buy into that delusion, which is not everyone can achieve those kind of numbers.
not everyone, no one can achieve those kind of numbers.
Yeah.
Nobody has in the history of the world, even with all the luck in the world. I mean,
Yeah.
Warren Buffett has not beaten the S&P 500 for the last 20 years. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
number. So
Yeah.
so no one has this magic wand. And I mean, I always say that Excel sheet is the biggest place for fairy tales. So you have these kind of things that this company will compound earnings at 20% for 25 years, and this is what the profit will be. And then on a fancy multiple on that, no one is doing even basic checks that what percentage of the industry it would be, or what percentage of the GDP it would be if it does compound at those levels. And both the business and the stock, which we, I mean, you can just make anything, and it's easiest thing in the world to drag a formula in Excel and
Yeah.
sell stories. So that unfortunately what a lot of professionals also do.
Yeah, and just I want to touch upon fintech and banking as a sector also, because I've often heard you say that I'm a very nervous investor in lenders. But on the private market side, the narrative that investors keep telling themselves is, lending is the biggest opportunity. 60, 70% of our market cap is ruled by banks. So there's a big bet on fintech companies which are into lending to be able to grow. And the market size numbers are obviously out there for everyone to see. But you've been very cautious of lending plays at large in banking companies, even in the public market space. So, what do you think is the real potential in the fintech space or banking? Where do you see this evolving?
First of all, I think, I don't know whether the long memory is a good or bad thing in this. You remember that every decade at least, there is some boom in some category of lending. So sometimes might be leasing company, or latest is this fintech, or that one of the quotes that I like is that almost all innovations in finance come down to only one thing: increasing leverage. So you have all, just it's repackaging of age old things that
Yeah,
you have like BNPL, buy now, pay later. What is it?
yeah,
It's an age old installment scheme that was going on even 100 years ago. Repackaged as buy now, pay later. Even, youngsters saying that I don't like debt. So I don't like taking loans. I am only on this BNPL scheme.
Yeah.
What is that?
It was a rude
Also,
shock to a lot of people when it showed up in their credit scores, that, that was actually loans and not just a fancy term called BNPL. It actually shows up in your credit score report.
so, I mean, I saw some statistic which I haven't verified, that if you look at the debt service burden of many Indians, that is really almost as high as it was in the US just before the 2008 crisis. So
Yeah.
while, because in India interest rates are higher, so while the debt to GDP or debt to wealth kind of number may not look so skewed, but if you look at the income inflow and versus the debt servicing outflow, that number is already pretty high in India. And I always laugh that when people say that so and so lender is growing faster than projected, I said, like, how difficult is it to give out money? Just getting it
Yeah.
back, that's the problem. So growing faster in a lending business is not always a good thing. And people forget. See, I mean, people say HDFC Bank and Kotak, look how much you would have made had you invested 20 years, 30 years ago. And they forget all the banks that came and went in the interim: Global Trust Bank, Times Guarantee Bank, Centurion Bank, let alone the PSUs, which also went under or had to be rescued, or Yes Bank went through a big upheaval. So
Yeah.
banking is a tough business. It's a highly leveraged business, and the issue is this: that sitting outside, you don't know the quality of the book. You don't know where the negative surprises are hiding. I said, like in the lending business, what really makes me uncomfortable is that negative surprises always will outnumber uh, positive surprises, and you don't know when, where they will come from, because you don't know the credit. So I
Yeah.
always say Amazon was a pure numbers call. HDFC Bank was a plus plus call, because Aditya downwards, most key people there were ex-City bankers. I knew them. I
Yeah.
knew their risk head was my last boss in City. So I said, if he is in charge, I know they will be relatively conservative. So, that gave me additional comfort. But banking and lending is a tough business. And I mean, all these factors that people say that it's growing much faster. It is, now the time to give the loan is down to, from 5 minutes is down to 2 minutes. I said, those are not parameters which are going to help you in a highly leveraged business, where a small hit, like a 5% hit on your book as a percentage of your capital, is very high. So that's the
Yeah.
fundamental, kind of there in the design of a lender. And
Yeah.
too many people started fintechs. I mean, I remember 3 4 years ago, someone was saying this time it's different, and look at this, and then went to an ex bankers party, and nearly everybody had started a fintech. So that
Yeah,
should
I
be.
think that is so true because, like you said, I think fintech is not about how quickly you can deploy capital. It's about how quickly you can collect that capital back. And a lot of the people just look at, aggressive loan book growth volume versus, looking at how much money is coming back into the system. And one stress scenario can actually break a lot of the equations, which we saw during the pandemic as well.
And also, I mean, people are taking loans not just to buy a mobile phone, they are taking loans to buy a pair of trousers. I mean,
Yeah.
that makes me shudder.
Yeah. Devina, coming back to an exciting news that you just posted today, you're putting a book out into the world. I know it's not out there yet, but can you give our audience a sneak peek into what this 75,000 word wonder is going to be?
It is thoughts on investing. So it's about, all the things uh, that you generally believe to be true, which are not true. Like, for example, invest only in your circle of competence. That that's actually something which means that your fund manager will only be investing in your comfort zone. So there are things like that, and also things which you should keep in mind. So a lot of it, for instance, the many things that we talked about today. So it is
Yeah.
about basic principles of investing. What you should, uh, what is generally believed to be true, which is not true, and what are the things which you're probably not looking at, or the frameworks you're not looking at that you should be looking at. So that's essentially what are the essential things to do, how to, when you start out, what are the core things which will determine most of your returns, those kind of things. Starting from there on to thoughts about investing, the future of investing, and also, of course, book list on this.
Fantastic. Really look forward to reading that, Devina. And you've been tirelessly at it for 30 years. Clearly, compounding is working in your favor. But coming to your personal drive and motivation, what's your personal ambition now for First Global? How do you see it evolving going forward?
Okay, the personal drive, I have to say, my drive has always been learning. So that has been the theme of my life, and there are very few careers where 30 years on, you can still be learning every day, where you don't know it all, you cannot know it all. So for
Yeah.
me, that's the thrill. And so, that is the continued. I mean, someone I met, right, a client I met last week was telling me that you obviously don't need to work for money or anything, or the name and everything is also all there. So why keep working? I said, like, because I really love what I am doing, and it has evolved. The business has evolved. I said, from the broking and investment banking to the other side, to asset management, and also from the conventional side to this artificial intelligence, machine learning, which was completely new learning for me. I'm not a techie. And now, of course, so yeah, as far as asset management is concerned, this is still early days. So there's lots more that can be done. I mean, that, like, on the scaling front, there's still a lot to be done. Besides, I said that the business itself evolves, that always your systems also evolve. That's the whole point, to make it better. So it's
Can you
still
quantify
quite
the
quite a
scale of First
long
Global?
horizon ahead. I feel.
Absolutely, and I wish you more and more decades of compounding. But can you talk about the scale and size of First Global right now for you audience to understand the scale?
So, I mean, we are, as I said, only on the portfolio management side in India right now. So, no mutual fund yet. Uh, and even there, the first 3 years, we've just gone past the 4-year mark. So, 3 years, we said, let it be only people coming to us through our website or social media. And only now we have started talking to distributors. So, big scaling up to happen there. Globally, we have been around on the asset management side far longer. So we deal with a lot of international family offices, managed accounts, etc. So all put together, we'll be managing something like $600 million or so, or 600 plus. So
Yeah, wonderful. And Jeff Bezos, who you've interacted with, has this regret minimization framework where he talks about looking at himself at the age of 80 and taking a lot of life decisions backwards. So, looking ahead at the age of 80 for you, Devina, what do you think your profound insights will be at that point? Specifically, distill it into one significant learning, one regret, and one pivotal life decision.
So starting from the bottom, the pivotal life decision obviously was becoming an entrepreneur at a time when, becoming an entrepreneur, or what's now called startup founder, was nothing that anybody wanted to
Yeah.
do. To give up what was considered a top job and to start this was, and there were obviously no funding available. Actually, never even looked for funding thereafter. So that was definitely a step away from all that I knew, and that turned out to be very good. I'm not a person for a lot of regrets in my life, so all my regrets have been very small things which I could learn from, and that too not many. So uh, uh, I don't know what my big regret would be. Probably making the wrong decision on the marriage front could be one. uh, uh, but I don't know, because in the end.
And one significant learning?
One is difficult, but I would say that, always, this is something that came very easily to me, but I see it doesn't come easily to most people, is that your goal should be to better yourself all the time. So for me, I was never very outwardly competitively focused, that I was always that I doing my best. So that was always my criteria. Always learning from first principles. do I really understand this? So I tell my people that don't use a formula where you can't show me the derivation. Don't use a model where you don't know the assumptions, because you're building a edifice on top of a foundation. So unless you know what's in the foundation, you'll be in trouble. So those are the things that have been very core to me. As I said, learning has been very core to me, and which I would also like to tell people that unless you feed your mind with a lot of reading, uh, things will not come out. It's always what you feed, and then it ferments, and then you build on it, and that's how things evolve. And as I said, don't be outwardly focused in terms of competition on whether it is external things like clothes or handbags or even anything. I mean, I give this example that in Lucknow University, in my undergrad, my marks were 88%, and the second highest was 78%. So if I had been benchmarking, probably the gap wouldn't have been so much. So always know, do your best. And people think do your best is a very weak statement, or a very low benchmark. But if you really think about it, that's the highest benchmark there is. That are you
Yeah.
really doing your best?
Love it. What a beautiful note to end the show with as well. Thank you so much, Devina, for coming on board. You're truly a legend and a stalwart in the field of public market investing, and we learned so much from you today. And I'm sure the audience will love this episode. Thank you so much for taking out time.
Thanks, Rishi. Thanks for having me.